I remember the exact moment I realized it was over, not with a scream, not with a fight, but with a silence so sharp it cut deeper than any argument could. Everything I thought I knew about trust, about loyalty, about us, evaporated in an instant. My name is Emily. I was 28, working as a marketing manager in Chicago, juggling long hours at a firm that demanded everything but gave little back. Mark, had been in my life for 7 years. 7 years that started like a dream and slowly unraveled into a quiet nightmare. I loved him fully, without hesitation, and I thought he felt the same. But love, I learned, doesn't always mean respect. Started with small things. Little lies about money, half-truths about where he was going, and excuses that seemed plausible at first. I told myself everyone has flaws, that trust was worth the risk. But the cracks widened and I began noticing the patterns. The sudden coldness, the dismissive comments, the way he laughed at things I didn't say out loud. I remember one night specifically. I had stayed late at the office, exhausted, dragging myself through the streets of downtown Chicago in the cold, hoping for a hug or a smile, something to remind me I mattered. When I got home, the apartment was quiet, but the air was heavy with a tension I couldn't explain. And then I saw it. A message flashing on his phone, left open on the table. The words didn't need to be read. They screamed betrayal. Another woman, someone I barely knew, someone he insisted was just a friend, had been there more than I could bear to imagine. My stomach sank, my hands shook, and for a moment I froze in disbelief. He came home minutes later, smiling, casual. That smile, the one I had once found comforting, felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving him with the casual pretense he thought would mask his deceit. For weeks I grappled with what to do. I couldn't confront him with anger, it would have fed him, allowed him to manipulate the situation again. Instead, I observed, silently noting every lie, every slip, every self-serving act. I kept meticulous mental records, not out of obsession but out of necessity. He had taken so much already. I refused to give him another ounce of power over me. The final straw came during a dinner with friends. We were at a small, dimly lit restaurant he insisted was special, a place that had once held meaning for us. Halfway through the meal, a colleague of his approached and whispered something in his ear. The way he stiffened, the way his eyes darted around, the quick, almost imperceptible lie he offered, it all hit me at once. I realized then that this was not a mistake, not a lapse, not a momentary weakness. This was his pattern. He had been undermining me, mocking me behind closed doors, eroding my sense of worth, and I had allowed it to happen for years. I left that night without a word, without the usual tears or begging. The air between us snapped like a frayed wire. When he called, I didn't answer. When he texted, I didn't reply. The more he tried, the more I receded into silence. And in that silence I found a strange clarity. I realized that revenge didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be dramatic. It needed to be quiet, unwavering, and irreversible. I began the first phase of my plan. I reclaimed my space, literally and emotionally. I changed my locks, cleaned out everything that reminded me of him, and slowly rebuilt the apartment to reflect my identity rather than our history. I also quietly reached out to his professional contacts, not to smear him, but to subtly remind them of his unreliability. I forwarded unpaid bills he had promised to handle, left notes on his professional accounts, and in small, almost imperceptible ways, showed that his careless behavior had consequences. Meanwhile, I focused on myself. I enrolled in a leadership course, started training for a half marathon I had always postponed, and reconnected with friends I had neglected. Each accomplishment, each small victory became a silent rebuke to him, a way of demonstrating that my life didn't end with his betrayal. And the most satisfying part? He never realized the full extent of my moves. He assumed I was broken, that I would grovel, that I would beg for reconciliation. But I didn't. I simply observed, quietly taking back control of my narrative. With every passing week, I could see his influence over my world diminish, not with drama or confrontation, but through steady, undeniable evidence of my independence and competence. It wasn't easy. There were nights when loneliness pressed down on me, when I questioned whether my approach was too cold, too calculated. But every time I reminded myself, dignity is more powerful than vengeance. Quiet power, earned through composure and intelligence, lasts longer than any fiery retaliation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel whole again. For weeks, I watched him struggle without ever showing him my hand. Mark had always thrived on control, subtle manipulations, the little lies that kept people off balance, the way he made everyone think he was indispensable. But now, for the first time, he was powerless. And the powerlessness was deliciously quiet. I started with his social circle. Not with confrontation, not with drama, but by simply showing up where he hadn't expected me. Networking events, casual gatherings, even mutual friends' dinners, I was present, composed, and confident. People noticed. I didn't boast or gloat. I just carried myself in a way that screamed, I am unbroken. Friends who had once only spoken to him began seeking me out, asking for my opinions, my guidance, my time. And Mark? He stood to the side, confused, unable to figure out why the attention shifted. Then came work. Mark had always had a certain charisma that made him seem indispensable at his job, a manager in a mid-level department that relied on him too heavily. But his habits were sloppy, his work half-finished, his promises hollow. I quietly collected evidence, documented every mistake he made, and began subtly sharing insights with his superiors without ever making it personal. I didn't attack him. I simply revealed the truth through facts. And the shift was remarkable. Suddenly, the gaps in his competence couldn't be ignored. He was passed over for projects, small promotions he had expected slipped away, and I watched from a distance as his carefully cultivated image crumbled. He was still the same man he had always been, but now the world finally saw him for what he truly was. The best part? He didn't suspect me. Not once. Every time he wondered why things weren't going his way, I smiled quietly to myself, knowing it was the cumulative effect of his own actions and my patient strategy. Socially, I didn't need to confront him either. I simply reclaimed the space he had tried to dominate. Friends who had been caught in the middle of our toxic dynamic were now free to interact with me without hesitation. Invitations that had once gone to him alone now included me. Conversations that had been one-sided now had a balance. And all the while, I never allowed myself to gloat. My quiet composure spoke louder than any words could. The psychological impact on Mark was subtle but profound. He began trying to regain control in small ways, testing boundaries, inserting himself into situations where he thought I would cave. But I had long since stopped bending. I listened without reacting, smiled without surrendering, and politely declined anything that threatened my newfound autonomy. Slowly, the frustration built in him, but he couldn't put a finger on why. That confusion, that sense of being outmaneuvered without confrontation, that was my revenge. Quiet, precise, and irreversible. There were moments when I almost felt pity for him. I remembered the man I thought I knew, the one I had loved so completely, and it was almost tragic to watch him fail in silence. But then I reminded myself, this wasn't about cruelty. This was about restoring balance, reclaiming dignity, and proving to myself that I didn't need his approval, attention, or manipulation to thrive. The more I flourished, the more irrelevant he became. And that was the sweetest outcome of all. Meanwhile, my personal life began to flourish. I took trips I had postponed, embraced hobbies I had set aside, and invested time in friendships and relationships that uplifted me rather than drained me. I realized that revenge wasn't a single act but a lifestyle change. A reassertion of self-worth that gradually made him powerless in my world. He had thrived on controlling me, but now control had shifted entirely. I was free and he was irrelevant. By the time we crossed paths again, everything had changed. A mutual friends party brought us under the same roof for the first time since my silent reclamation had begun. He approached cautiously with that familiar smile, probably thinking he could charm or manipulate me like before. But I was different now. I didn't flinch. I didn't stumble. I acknowledged him politely, then walked away, mingling with people who truly mattered, who respected me for the first time in years. The look on his face was telling. Confusion, frustration, and the dawning realization that he had lost, not because I had publicly humiliated him, not because I had yelled or cried, but because I had quietly, relentlessly taken back my power. He had nothing to leverage against me, nothing to manipulate, nothing to control. And in that quiet, unspoken moment I had won. I didn't need applause or validation. My revenge wasn't about seeing him suffer. It was about seeing myself restored. Every achievement, every social victory, every quiet act of self-respect was a statement. I am whole. I am independent. And no one can take that away. It was a revelation too. Revenge doesn't have to be loud to be effective. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It just needs to be intentional, patient, and grounded in dignity. Every small act that rebuilt my life, every step I took to assert my worth, was part of the long arc of justice. And watching him fade from relevance quietly, irreversibly, was more satisfying than any shouted confrontation ever could be. Months passed, and life began to feel astonishingly peaceful. I no longer tracked his movements or wondered what he was doing. His presence in my life had dwindled to near nothing. And yet, the lessons he left behind lingered. Reminders of boundaries I would never compromise, of self-worth I would never surrender again. One quiet evening, I found myself at a small rooftop cafe overlooking the city. The skyline was dotted with lights, each one reflecting a life being lived fully and freely. I sipped my coffee and thought about the journey I had taken. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the long, meticulous process of reclaiming my world. It struck me then that true revenge isn't a spectacle. It doesn't need witnesses. It is the steady, unshakable rebuilding of one's own life while the betrayer slowly loses access to it. Mark had become almost a ghost in my world. Mutual friends no longer consulted him about decisions. Colleagues stopped including him in critical meetings. Opportunities that once seemed within his grasp were now out of reach. He wasn't humiliated by a scandal or punished publicly. Instead, he had simply lost influence, relevance, and control gradually, silently, and irreversibly. And the remarkable thing was that none of this had required me to stoop to his level. I hadn't yelled, exposed, or shamed him. I had let dignity do the work. There were times I reflected on the what-ifs. What if I had confronted him aggressively? What if I had sought revenge in the traditional sense? But each time I realized that those paths offered only temporary satisfaction. Public confrontation might have scorched him in the moment, but it would have left me tangled in anger, bitterness, and drama. My method, quiet, deliberate, unassailable, ensured I retained peace and self-respect while removing him from my world permanently. I even ran into him once, months after the climax of my quiet campaign. It was at a networking event, crowded, noisy, and full of people I respected. He approached me, smiling nervously, probably testing to see if I had softened. I nodded politely, nothing more. In that brief interaction, I felt a sense of closure stronger than any confrontation could have given. He had no power, no influence, no leverage. And he knew it, even if he couldn't articulate it. My friends noticed the change too. They remarked on how calm and grounded I had become, how confident I carried myself without arrogance. Some asked what had happened, expecting a dramatic tale of revenge or public fallout. I simply smiled, choosing silence over exposition. True power, I had learned, is often invisible to those who expect spectacle. It resides in composure, in boundaries, in self-respect. I realized that my life had become a testament to quiet justice. The betrayal I had endured could have destroyed me, but instead, it became a catalyst for growth. I had taken back control not through confrontation or vengeance, but through presence, consistency, and dignity. Every small decision to assert myself, every subtle act of reclaiming autonomy, had accumulated into irreversible change. And in that I found freedom. Looking back, I understood the most profound lesson. The person who betrays you only has power if you allow it. By refusing to beg, refusing to justify, refusing to compromise your dignity, I had shifted the balance completely. And the satisfaction of seeing someone fade from relevance without a single dramatic blow, that was far sweeter than any public humiliation could have been. Life continued to flourish. I traveled, advanced in my career, deepened friendships, and even began a relationship built on mutual respect and transparency. I no longer carried anger like a shield. Instead, I carried confidence, composure, and clarity. The betrayal that had once felt devastating became a lesson etched into the fabric of who I had become. Resilient, wise, and self-assured. Sometimes I think about Mark quietly, almost nostalgically. Not with desire, not with hatred, but with the recognition of how powerless he had become in my life. The tables had turned entirely, and he had no idea how or why. That silent victory, I realized, is far more satisfying than any visible revenge because it leaves the betrayer with no recourse. No chance to claw back influence, no way to manipulate. And in that quiet, unshakable space, I finally felt complete. I had endured betrayal, humiliation, and deceit, and I had emerged whole. I had regained control, rebuilt my identity, and established boundaries that no one could cross. I had learned that self-respect is the ultimate revenge, and dignity is the most enduring weapon. I often share my story not to boast, but to remind anyone who has been betrayed that you can reclaim your life without theatrics. You don't need to scream, to fight, or to shame. You simply need patience, clarity, and a refusal to allow anyone else to define your worth. The world notices composure, consistency, and quiet strength more than chaos. And the ultimate revenge isn't destruction. It's the serene, unshakable rebuilding of yourself while the betrayer fades into irrelevance.